This week, my son asked me for $800 rent. I replied with a $2 million receipt and a new home next door. But the silence that followed almost destroyed me. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning, cutting through the gray February light filtering through my cramped Queens apartment. "Mom, I need $800 for rent." Danny's voice cracked through the static. I sat there in my faded blue robe, the receiver trembling in my arthritic hands, staring at that old photo on my nightstand. Him at 8 years old, gap-toothed smile, holding a dandelion he'd picked for me. The very next day, I held glossy papers in those same shaking hands. A receipt for $2 million spent on the brownstone next door to his crumbling Brooklyn apartment. This week, everything I believed about love, family, and sacrifice crumbled like old plaster falling from these worn walls. But somehow, impossibly, it began to rebuild into something stronger. Every morning for the past 15 years, I've awakened to the same ritual of pain. The subway rumbles beneath my feet at 5:30 sharp, rattling the thin windows of this tiny apartment I've called home since Danny was 12. My bones ache deeper now, especially my knees that carried me through decades of night shifts at the hospital. Double shifts when his father walked out, triple shifts when Danny needed bail money, rehab fees, court costs. The coffee maker gurgles to life, brewing the same weak blend I've stretched to last 2 weeks. The microwave dinner sits cold on chipped porcelain that once belonged to my mother. She'd be horrified to see how I live now, how small my world has become. But she never had to choose between eating and helping her child survive another month. My calendar hangs beside the refrigerator, filled with doctor appointments I keep postponing because the copays add up. Cardiologist next Tuesday, orthopedist the following week. Physical therapy I canceled again because Danny needed grocery money. The phone rings at least 3 times a week. Always the same voice. Always the same desperate need. "I promise I'll pay you back this time, Mom. I swear on Grandma's grave." But the promises evaporate like steam from my morning tea. The rent never reaches his landlord. The utility bills pile up like autumn leaves, ignored until the power gets cut. Every excuse sounds rehearsed now, polished smooth by repetition. The job interview that went great, but they hired someone else. The paycheck that got delayed because of bank problems. The wallet stolen on the subway, taking 2 weeks of earnings. I listen because what else can a mother do? I send the money because abandoning him feels like amputating part of my soul. But doubt creeps in during those 3 a.m. moments when sleep won't come, when the city noise fades to whispers, and I'm left alone with questions that have no good answers. Am I helping or enabling? Am I loving or being used? When did my child become a stranger who only calls when he needs something? Danny lives in Williamsburg now, in a converted warehouse that seems too expensive for someone perpetually broke. When I visit, he's always rushing off somewhere important, phone buzzing with messages he can't ignore. The apartment feels temporary, unlived in, like a stage set waiting for the real tenants. His girlfriend Rachel answers the door sometimes, polite but distant, her eyes holding knowledge she won't share. "He's at a meeting," she'll say, though I never know what kind. "He'll call you later," but later never comes. Days pass before my phone rings again, and when it does, the conversation follows the same script. "How's your health, Mom?" "Fine." I lie, because my problems seem small compared to his crisis of the week. "How's work?" "Getting by." I lie again, because admitting I'm living on Social Security and the tiny pension from 30 years of nursing makes me feel like I've failed him somehow. Then comes the real reason for the call, wrapped in guilt and desperation like a bitter pill I'm expected to swallow without complaint. The worst part is how normal it's all become. How quickly $200 here, $500 there became my new reality. How I stopped buying new clothes, stopped eating at restaurants, stopped living because keeping Danny afloat became my full-time job without salary or vacation days. My sister Margaret warns me during our monthly phone calls from Phoenix. "You're enabling him, Linda. You know that, right?" But Margaret never had children. She never felt that primal pull to fix, to save, to sacrifice everything for someone who shares your DNA and your heart. She never lay awake wondering if this is the night her child doesn't come home, if this is the call that changes everything forever. The breaking point came slowly, like water wearing away stone. It started with the small lies, the inconsistencies in his stories that I pretended not to notice. The rent money that should have been $600 but was always $800. The apartment address that changed without explanation. The landlord who was never available when I called to confirm Danny's payments. Then came that cold January morning when everything shifted. I was walking through his neighborhood, trying to find the address he'd given me. carrying a bag of groceries I couldn't afford, and medicine for a cough that had lingered for weeks. The building number he'd texted didn't exist. The street dead-ended at a construction site where gentrification met reality in piles of broken concrete. My phone showed 17 missed calls. Danny's voice on the voicemail was frantic. "Mom, where are you? I've been waiting at the apartment. The groceries, remember? I need those groceries." But there was no apartment. Just empty lots and half-demolished buildings where nobody lived, where nobody could live. The address he'd been using for months was fiction, a story crafted to keep the money flowing from my bank account to his. I stood there on that broken street corner, grocery bag growing heavy in my arms, watching my breath make small clouds in the winter air. Homeless men clustered around a trash can fire, sharing cigarettes and quiet conversation. They looked at me with curious kindness, as if they recognized something familiar in my confusion. "You lost, honey?" one of them asked, his voice gentle despite the roughness around the edges. I was. I had been lost for so long I'd forgotten what found felt like. Lost in the maze of my son's needs, his lies, his bottomless capacity to consume my life without offering anything back. Lost in the fog of sacrificial love that had become indistinguishable from slow suicide. Walking home that day, I made a decision that felt like jumping off a cliff. I was going to stop. Stop sending money. Stop asking questions I didn't want answered. Stop pretending that love could fix what was fundamentally broken between us. But first, I needed to understand exactly how broken it was. The detective work began that evening. Bank statements spread across my kitchen table like evidence at a crime scene. 18 months of transfers, each one documented with mechanical precision. 800 here, 600 there, emergency funds for crises that seemed to multiply like cancer cells. $23,000. In 18 months, I had sent my son enough money to buy a car, take a cruise around the world, or put a down payment on a small house. Instead, it had disappeared into the black hole of his addiction, his lies, his complete inability to function as an adult. The worst part was seeing the pattern, how the requests increased after each payment, like feeding a stray cat that brings more strays the next day, how the emergencies became more urgent, more life-threatening, designed to bypass my rational mind and trigger my panic buttons. "Mom, they're going to evict me tomorrow if I don't pay." "Mom, I haven't eaten in 2 days." "Mom, Rachel is pregnant and we need money for the doctor." Each lie was carefully calibrated to my specific weaknesses as a mother, my terror of his homelessness, my memory of his hungry childhood, my hope that somehow, this time, he was really trying to build something permanent and good. But pregnancy tests are $15 at the pharmacy. Food banks exist in every neighborhood. Housing assistance programs have waiting lists, but they don't evict people overnight without legal process. Every emergency had free or low-cost solutions he refused to consider because they required effort instead of a phone call to mom. I spent the next week calling every number I could find: shelters, social services, community organizations that helped people struggling with addiction and housing. What I learned made my stomach clench like a fist. Danny qualified for food stamps, Medicaid, housing assistance, job training programs, and addiction counseling services. He could have been living in transitional housing with case management support while working toward independence. Instead, he was living off me, using my fear and love as the foundation for a lifestyle that required no accountability, no growth, no change. The social worker I spoke with was kind but direct. "Ma'am, as long as there's someone willing to enable the addiction, recovery becomes optional. The pain has to reach a level where change feels easier than staying the same. Right now, you're managing his pain for him." Enabling. That word followed me everywhere. I heard it in the subway's mechanical rhythm. I saw it reflected in store windows as I walked through Jackson Heights, watching other mothers push strollers and hold small hands, remembering when love felt simple and mutual. I had become an enabler. Not a mother, not a helper, not a solution. An enabler, someone whose love had become poison disguised as medicine. The next call came on a Friday evening. Same voice, same desperation, same request wrapped in new packaging. "Mom, I need $800 for rent. The landlord says if I don't pay by Monday, I'm out on the street. I can't be homeless again. You know what happened last time." But this time I didn't reach for my checkbook. This time I asked questions. "What's the landlord's name, Danny?" "What? Why do you need to know that?" "I want to call and confirm the amount. Make sure 800 covers everything." Silence. Then anger. "You don't trust me? After everything we've been through, you think I'm lying? I think you're sick. And I think I've been making your sickness worse by not letting you hit bottom." He hung up. The silence in my apartment felt different afterward, less oppressive and more like possibility. For the first time in years, my phone wasn't going to ring with another crisis I was expected to solve. But freedom tastes bitter at first, especially when it's mixed with decades of guilt. I paced my small living room, counting steps between the couch and the window. 9 steps to the east wall, where his school pictures hung in mismatched frames. 12 to the kitchen, where I'd prepared thousands of meals he never stayed to eat. 15 to the bathroom, where I'd hidden prescription bottles from him since he was 16. This apartment held so many memories they seemed to echo off the walls like ghosts. Danny's first steps, taken between the couch and coffee table. His last Christmas morning here, age 22, opening presents I couldn't afford while complaining they weren't what he'd wanted. The fights, the tears, the promises made and broken so many times the words lost meaning. Every surface held evidence of my devotion. Photos from school, plays I attended alone because his father was working. Report cards I'd saved despite the failing grades. Birthday cards I'd written to myself, signed Love Danny, because he never remembered the date. I was 67 years old, living in a shrine to a child who had died somewhere along the way, replaced by this stranger who wore his face but didn't share his heart. That night, I called my sister Margaret. She answered on the second ring, as if she'd been waiting. "Linda, you sound different." I stopped sending money. Silence. Then, "Good. How do you feel?" "Terrified and relieved. And guilty as hell." "The guilt will pass. The relief is what matters." Margaret had been waiting 15 years for this conversation. She'd watched me disappear into my son's chaos, watched my health deteriorate from stress, watched my savings evaporate into his seemingly endless need. She'd offered advice I couldn't hear, support I couldn't accept, perspective I wasn't ready to see. "What changed your mind?" I told her about the fake address, the detective work, the social worker's words. She listened without judgment, the way siblings do when they've been holding vigil for someone they love. "I want to come visit," she said finally. "Not to help you with Danny, to help you with you." The idea of having an ally, someone on my side instead of his, felt revolutionary. For so long, every relationship had been measured by how it served his needs. Friends who couldn't understand were abandoned. Family members who asked hard questions were avoided. My world had shrunk until it contained exactly 2 people. Danny and me, predator and prey, caught in a dance that was killing us both. Margaret arrived the following Tuesday, carrying 2 suitcases and an energy I'd forgotten existed. She was 70, 5 years younger, but looking decades more vibrant. Her hair was silver white and styled, not gray-brown, and pulled into the same tired bun I'd worn for years. Her clothes were bright, purposeful, chosen for joy instead of invisibility. "My God, Linda, when's the last time you bought yourself something nice?" I couldn't remember. Everything I owned was functional, utilitarian, designed to last until the emergency fund dried up. My shoes were practical, my coat was warm, my dresses were dark enough to hide stains and old enough to be invisible. "Come on," she said, dropping her suitcase by the door. "We're going shopping. I can't afford—" "I can. And before you argue, this isn't charity. This is an investment in my sister's recovery." Recovery. Like I was the one struggling with addiction. But maybe I was. Maybe love, badly practiced, could be as destructive as heroin. We spent the afternoon in department stores I hadn't entered in years. Margaret pulled clothes from racks while I protested the expense, the impracticality, the foolishness of spending money on myself when Danny might need help. "Danny will always need help," she said, holding a red sweater against my chest. "The question is whether you're going to need help too." The red sweater cost $49. In my world, that was almost 2 days of groceries, a month of bus fare, the copay for a specialist visit I'd been postponing. But Margaret insisted, and something about the color, bright, unapologetic, demanding attention, made me feel different when I put it on. The woman in the dressing room mirror was a stranger. Still old, still tired, but somehow more present. The red brought color to my cheeks, made my eyes look clearer, my posture straighter. I looked like someone worth knowing, worth loving, worth investing in. "That's the one," Margaret said, "and we're getting the blue one too." At home that evening, she cooked dinner while I sorted through bank statements, trying to calculate how much money I'd saved by not sending Danny $800. The math was depressing and liberating. Depressing because it showed how much I'd been living without. Liberating because it showed how much was possible if I stopped. "What do you want to do with your life?" Margaret asked over chicken and rice that tasted better than anything I'd eaten in months. The question was so unexpected I couldn't answer. Want? I'd stopped wanting things so long ago the muscle had atrophied. I wanted Danny to get clean. I wanted him to be happy. I wanted him to love me the way I loved him. But wants for myself? Personal desires that had nothing to do with fixing someone else? "I used to paint," I said finally, "before Danny was born. Watercolors mostly. Landscapes and still lifes. What happened to your supplies? Sold them when Danny needed money for his first rehab. Margaret nodded like she'd expected this answer. Tomorrow, we're buying you new brushes. That night, I dreamed about color for the first time in years. Not the gray-brown of my daily life, but the brilliant oranges of sunset, the deep blues of ocean water, the countless greens of spring leaves uncurling toward light. I woke up feeling something I'd almost forgotten, excited about the day ahead. But Danny called before I could pour my first cup of coffee. Margaret answered the phone while I was in the shower, and when I emerged, she was holding the receiver like it might bite her. "He's very angry," she said, "and very manipulative. Impressive, actually. He managed to make me feel guilty in under 30 seconds. What did he say? That you're having some kind of breakdown, that you've never acted this way before and he's worried about your mental health, that family members should stick together instead of letting outside influences drive them apart. Outside influences. As if Margaret was a stranger instead of my sister, as if her love for me was somehow less valid than his need for money. He wants to come over to check on me," I said, "over my dead body." Margaret's protectiveness felt foreign and wonderful. I couldn't remember the last time someone had stood between me and Danny's demands, the last time someone had prioritized my well-being over his comfort. "He'll keep calling. Then we'll turn off the phone." Such a simple solution. Turn off the phone. Don't answer the door. Create a boundary and defend it. The idea felt radical and terrifying and absolutely necessary. We spent the morning at an art supply store in Manhattan, a wonderland of possibilities I'd forgotten existed. Brushes in every size, paints in colors that didn't have names, papers textured like clouds and smooth as silk. Margaret watched me touch everything like I was meeting old friends after a long absence. "Buy what makes you happy," she said. "Not what's practical, not what's on sale. What makes you happy?" I chose watercolors in tubes instead of the cheaper pans, brushes with natural bristles instead of synthetic, paper thick enough to handle multiple washes without warping. The total came to over $200, more than I'd spent on myself in the past 2 years combined. Walking home with bags full of art supplies, I felt giddy and guilty in equal measure. Giddy because the weight in my hands represented possibility, creativity, the reclamation of dreams I'd abandoned for someone else's emergencies. Guilty because Danny was probably hungry somewhere, probably struggling, probably hating me for choosing myself over him. "The guilt will pass," Margaret said, reading my expression, "but the art will last." That afternoon, I set up a makeshift studio in my living room, clearing Danny's pictures from the side table to make room for paint tubes and water jars. The first brushstroke felt like prayer, like coming home after decades of exile. I painted the view from my window. Fire escapes and brick buildings, laundry lines strung between tenements, the small squares of sky visible between closer structures. Not beautiful in any conventional sense, but real, immediate, mine. The phone rang while I painted. 8 times. I didn't answer. Each unanswered ring felt like a small victory, a declaration of independence from the tyranny of his needs. "How does it feel?" Margaret asked, watching me blend gray and blue for the evening shadows. "Selfish," I admitted, "and wonderful." "Good. You've been selfless so long you forgot you had a self worth caring for." We ordered Chinese food that night, eating straight from the containers while my painting dried on the table between us. The fortune cookie message made us both laugh. Your future is created by what you do today. But my new peace was shattered 2 days later when Danny appeared at my door. I saw him through the peephole first. Thinner than the last time, hair unwashed, clothes that hung loose on his diminished frame. He looked exactly like someone who needed $800 for rent. Someone whose mother should open the door immediately and write a check without asking questions. My hand was on the lock before I caught myself. Margaret appeared behind me, her presence solid and reassuring. "You don't have to let him in. He's my son. He's your addiction, and addictions lie to get what they want." Through the door, Danny's voice was pleading, reasonable, designed to hit every maternal trigger I possessed. "Mom, I know you're in there. I just want to talk. I'm worried about you. Mrs. Rodriguez downstairs said you haven't been answering your phone." Mrs. Rodriguez, who'd watched me struggle for years without offering help, who'd complained about Danny's loud visits and late-night arguments. Now she was his ally, another voice in the chorus of people who thought I was wrong to finally prioritize my own well-being. "Please, Mom, 5 minutes. I promise I'm not here for money. I just need to see that you're okay." But I knew that script too. Start with concern, add guilt, escalate to threats, end with tears and promises, and another emergency that required immediate financial intervention. The dance we'd perfected over 15 years of his addiction and my enabling. "I'm fine, Danny, but I'm not ready to see you right now." "What does that mean?" "I'm your son. You can't just cut me off like I'm some stranger. Except that's exactly what he'd become. A stranger who shared my DNA but not my values, who knew exactly what to say to make me feel responsible for his choices, who'd turned the love between mother and child into a business transaction with only one winner. Margaret squeezed my shoulder. You're doing great. Stay strong. Mom, please. I'm scared. Things are really bad right now, and I don't have anyone else. The hook, perfectly baited. I don't have anyone else. Because he'd burned through every other relationship with his lies and needs. Because friends and girlfriends and employers had all reached their limits with his chaos. Only I remained, only I was still willing to be used up in service of his addiction. I love you, Danny, but I can't help you anymore. Can't or won't. The distinction mattered to him because it preserved his victim status. Can't suggested I was powerless, overwhelmed, temporarily unable to fulfill my role as his safety net. Won't suggested choice, boundaries, the possibility that his behavior had consequences. Won't, I said clearly. I won't help you anymore. Silence. Then the sound of his footsteps on the stairs, heavy with anger and disbelief. He'd never heard that word from me before. Won't. It was foreign territory for both of us. I slumped against the door, exhausting flooding through me like water through a broken dam. Margaret held me while I cried. Not the silent tears of helpless grief I'd been shedding for years, but the loud, messy sobs of someone finally fighting back. Was I too harsh? You were perfect, firm but loving. That's what boundaries sound like. Boundaries. Another new word in my vocabulary. Lines drawn in the sand between what I would and wouldn't accept, between love and enabling, between helping and hurting. That evening, Margaret and I researched support groups for families affected by addiction. I'd resisted them for years, convinced that my situation was unique, that other people couldn't understand the specific ways my love had become weaponized against me. But the stories I read online were eerily familiar. Mothers who'd bankrupted themselves trying to save children who didn't want to be saved, fathers who'd lost homes, marriages, retirement savings to sons and daughters whose addiction consumed everything within reach, grandparents raising grandchildren while the parents disappeared into cycles of recovery and relapse that followed no predictable pattern. I wasn't alone. I wasn't uniquely unlucky or uniquely generous. I was part of a vast community of people who'd confused love with surrender, who'd learned too late that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stop helping. The Al-Anon meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening in the basement of St. Mary's Catholic Church in Elmhurst. Margaret offered to drive me, but this felt like something I needed to do alone. A declaration of independence from the well-meaning people in my life who wanted to rescue me from my rescuing instincts. 8 people sat in a circle of folding chairs, ranging from a woman my age to a man who couldn't have been older than 30. Each carried the same expression I saw in my mirror: love mixed with exhaustion, hope tempered by experience, the hollow look of people who'd given everything and received nothing sustainable in return. Would anyone like to share? Asked the group leader, a middle-aged woman whose gentle eyes suggested she'd walked this path herself. I raised my hand before I could change my mind. My name is Linda, and my son is an addict. The words felt strange and true and utterly terrifying. For years, I'd avoided that label, as if naming the problem would make it more real. But denial had protected nothing and no one. Danny was still sick. I was still broken. The only difference was that now I was willing to admit both truths. I stopped giving him money this week, I continued, and I feel guilty and relieved and scared that I've destroyed our relationship. Nods around the circle. These people knew. They'd stood at the same crossroads, made the same impossible choice between enabling and abandoning, learned the difference between love and suicide by slow degrees. An older man named Frank spoke next. 20 years, I gave my daughter money. 20 years of rent payments, car repairs, bail bonds, lawyer fees. You know what I got for my trouble? Silence. A daughter who died of an overdose with $50 of my money in her pocket and 3 years since our last real conversation. His words hit like physical blows. This was the other side of enabling, the shadow version of my story where love without boundaries led not to recovery, but to graveyards. I don't know if saying no earlier would have saved her, Frank continued, but I know that saying yes didn't. After the meeting, I sat in my car for 20 minutes, processing what I'd heard. Stories of families destroyed by addiction, but also stories of recovery that began when the money stopped flowing. Children who'd hit bottom and clawed their way back up. Parents who'd reclaimed their lives after decades of servitude to someone else's illness. The drive home took me through Danny's neighborhood. I found myself slowing down, looking for him in the faces of people walking the streets. Part of me hoped to see him, to confirm he was alive and safe. Part of me hoped not to to avoid the pull of his need and my guilt. I didn't see him, but I saw the building where he'd claimed to live, the address I'd been sending money to for months. A for rent sign hung in the window, suggesting it had been vacant longer than he'd been supposedly living there. More evidence of the elaborate fiction he'd constructed to keep me sending checks. At home, Margaret was reading in my living room, looking comfortable and settled in a way that made my chest tighten with gratitude. Having someone on my side, someone who wanted nothing from me except my company and well-being, felt like discovering water after years of thirst. How was the meeting? Hard, helpful, horrible. I sat down beside her, suddenly exhausted. There was a man whose daughter died, after 20 years of him trying to save her. Margaret closed her book and looked at me directly. "Do you think Danny's going to die?" The question I'd been avoiding for years. The possibility that lurked behind every late-night phone call, every long silence between contacts. Yes, I thought Danny might die. From overdose. From violence. From the 100 small dangers that surrounded people living in chaos and desperation. Maybe. And do you think giving him money makes him more likely to survive, or less likely? Another question I'd been avoiding. The money I sent didn't go toward food or shelter, despite his claims. It went toward drugs, toward maintaining the lifestyle that was slowly killing him. Every dollar I transferred enabled another day of using, another postponement of the crisis that might finally motivate recovery. "Less likely," I whispered. "Then you're not abandoning him. You're trying to save his life." The reframing was revolutionary. Instead of failing as a mother, I was finally learning to mother effectively. Instead of withholding love, I was offering the tough love that true recovery required. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally are different skills entirely. My head understood that boundaries were necessary. My heart still ached every time the phone rang and I didn't answer. The breakthrough came the following Monday when I ran into Rachel, Danny's on-and-off girlfriend, at the grocery store. She looked surprised to see me, then guilty, as if my presence reminded her of secrets she'd been keeping. "Hi, Mrs. Patterson. How are you?" "I'm well, Rachel." "How's Danny?" She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "He's struggling. He's angry at you for cutting him off." "I didn't cut him off. I stopped enabling his addiction." The distinction seemed to surprise her. "He says you've never acted like this before. He's worried you're having some kind of breakdown." The narrative Danny had constructed to explain my behavior. Mental illness, temporary insanity, anything except the possibility that I'd finally seen our relationship clearly and decided to change it. "Rachel, how long have you known that Danny wasn't living where he said he was living?" Her face flushed. "I don't know what you mean." "The address he gave me for rent money. How long have you known it was fake?" Silence, then tears. "He made me promise not to tell you. He said if you knew the truth, you'd stop helping him, and then he'd have nowhere to go." Where was he really living? With me. In my studio apartment. But my lease doesn't allow overnight guests more than 3 nights a month. The super was starting to ask questions. Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Danny wasn't homeless or at risk of homelessness. He had shelter, just not the kind that justified $800 in monthly payments to his mother. "Where did the rent money go, Rachel?" She couldn't meet my eyes. "Drugs, mostly. Sometimes food. Sometimes he'd buy things and sell them for cash. I tried to get him to stop asking you for money, but he said it was easy and you never asked hard questions." Easy. My love had become the path of least resistance, the solution that required no effort or change on his part. As long as I was willing to finance his addiction, recovery remained optional. "I want to help him," Rachel continued, "but I don't know how." "You help him by not helping him, by making using consequences instead of comfortable, by refusing to enable what's killing him." She nodded like she'd been waiting for someone to give her permission to stop being part of the problem. That evening, I called the drug treatment centers I'd researched months earlier, when I'd still believed love alone could motivate Danny's recovery. I had questions now that I should have asked then. What did they recommend for family members? How could I support his recovery without enabling his addiction? What were the signs that someone was truly ready to change versus just trying to manipulate their way back into the money stream? The intake coordinator at the third facility was particularly helpful. "Ma'am, we see this situation constantly. Family members who love someone into sickness instead of health. The good news is that boundaries work. When using becomes uncomfortable enough, people often choose recovery. And if he doesn't choose recovery, then at least you've stopped contributing to the problem. Either way, you win." Winning. Such a strange concept when applied to family relationships. But maybe there were different types of winning. Maybe refusing to be destroyed by someone else's self-destructive choices was its own victory. The next few weeks passed in a rhythm I hadn't experienced in years, peaceful. No emergency phone calls, no sudden financial crises, No Danny-related chaos disrupting my sleep and appetite and basic sense of safety in the world. Margaret stayed for a month, helping me establish routines that prioritized my well-being. Morning walks around the neighborhood, afternoon painting sessions that gradually filled the walls with color and light, evening phone calls to friends I'd neglected during the years of crisis management. I attended Al-Anon meetings twice a week, slowly learning the vocabulary of recovery. Detachment with love, powerlessness over other people's choices. The difference between supporting someone and supporting their illness. The group became my lifeline, filled with people who understood the specific grief of loving someone whose addiction had transformed them into a stranger. We shared strategies for handling manipulation, guilt, and the crushing fear that saying no might result in tragedy. My daughter hasn't spoken to me in 6 months, shared Maria, a woman about my age whose story of financial exploitation was eerily similar to mine. But she's in rehab now. For the first time in 20 years, she's sober. How do you know it's working this time? Because she's paying for it herself, because nobody's making it easy for her to fail. Self-funded recovery. The concept was revolutionary. Danny had been through 4 treatment programs, all paid for by me, all followed by relapses that seemed almost immediate. But maybe the problem wasn't the quality of treatment. Maybe the problem was that recovery without personal investment was just another form of entertainment. After Margaret left, I faced the challenge of maintaining my new boundaries without her support and encouragement. The apartment felt different with just me in it. Larger somehow, less cluttered with other people's crises. I'd rearranged the furniture to create a dedicated art space, transforming the corner where Danny's pictures had dominated into a studio filled with brushes and color. My paintings were getting better. Not museum quality, but recognizable as the work of someone finding joy in the process of creation. Landscapes from memory. Still lifes of objects that held meaning. My mother's teacup, the red sweater Margaret had bought me, the first brush I'd purchased for myself in 20 years. Danny called on Easter Sunday. I saw his name on the caller ID and felt the familiar lurch of anxiety and love and dread. 4 months of no contact. 4 months of wondering if he was alive or dead or something in between. I answered on the 5th ring. Mom? His voice sounded different. Clearer, somehow. Less desperate and more genuinely sad. Hi, Danny. I want to apologize. I've been thinking about everything, and I want to apologize. The words I'd been waiting years to hear, but I'd learned enough about manipulation to be cautious of gifts that arrived without context. What are you apologizing for? For lying to you. For taking your money when I knew I wasn't using it for rent. For making you feel guilty when you finally set boundaries. Specific apologies. That was new. Usually his contrition was vague and self-serving. Sorry for everything. Sorry you're upset. Sorry things have been difficult. Where are you, Danny? Rehab. Real rehab this time. Residential treatment, 90 days minimum. I've been here for 6 weeks. How are you paying for it? Insurance. And I got a job in the kitchen to cover the copays. It's the first time I've ever paid for my own treatment. The first time. Confirmation that all my previous investments in his recovery had been meaningless because they'd cost him nothing. I'm proud of you for taking responsibility. I want to see you when I get out, if you're willing. But I want you to know that I'm not calling for money. I know you're not going to give me money anymore, and I respect that. Respect. Another new word in his vocabulary. I'd like to see you too, when you're ready. I might not be ready for a long time. They say I need to focus on myself right now, not on repairing relationships I damaged. Healthy boundaries, coming from him instead of me. The treatment program was teaching him the same lessons I'd been learning in Al-Anon. Take all the time you need, Danny. I'm not going anywhere. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen staring at the phone, processing the conversation. No requests for money, no manipulation or guilt trips, no promises about quick fixes or immediate changes, just acknowledgement of harm done and commitment to doing the work of recovery. It might have been an act. Addiction was cunning, and people in treatment learned to say what their families wanted to hear. But something in his voice had sounded different, humbled in a way I'd never heard before. Whether the change was real or not, I had changed. I had learned to separate love from enabling, support from rescue, hope from denial. If Danny was truly in recovery, we could build a new relationship based on mutual respect and healthy boundaries. If he wasn't, I would survive his continued illness without destroying myself in the process. Either way, I was free. That evening, I painted the sunset from my fire escape, watching the sky turn orange and pink above the Queen's skyline. The colors were more vivid than they'd been during the years when Danny's crises had colored everything gray. Or maybe I was just seeing more clearly now that my vision wasn't clouded by constant worry and enabling behaviors. My phone rang twice that week. Friends calling to chat, sister calling to check in. No emergencies, no crises, No sudden needs that required immediate financial intervention. The silence was peaceful instead of ominous, welcome instead of threatening. I started taking classes at the community center, watercolor technique on Tuesday mornings, senior fitness on Thursday afternoons, book club every other week. Simple pleasures I'd abandoned during the years of crisis management, activities chosen for joy instead of obligation. The other students in watercolor class were mostly women my age, retired teachers and nurses and homemakers who'd raised children and were now reclaiming creative dreams they'd deferred for decades. We painted together in comfortable silence, occasionally sharing stories about grandchildren or health concerns or the challenges of living on fixed incomes. None of them asked about my family. In this space, I existed as Linda the artist, not Linda the mother of an addict. I could talk about color theory and brush techniques instead of deflecting questions about why my son never visited or called. The book club was harder because literature inevitably touched on family relationships, addiction, the complicated love between parents and children. But hearing other people discuss these themes from the safety of fiction helped me process my own experiences without the immediate emotional charge. "Do you think she should have helped her son?" asked Eleanor, discussing a novel about a mother whose gambling-addicted child had stolen her retirement savings. "Helping and enabling aren't the same thing," I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. "Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to participate in someone's self-destruction." The group nodded thoughtfully. Several women shared their own stories of children who'd struggled with various addictions, relationships that had been tested by the tension between love and boundaries. I wasn't alone. My situation wasn't unique or shameful or evidence of my failure as a mother. I was part of a common human experience, learning lessons that millions of parents had learned before me, and millions more would learn in the future. Summer arrived with unusual clarity. Instead of the typical New York humidity and heat that made everything feel oppressive, the days were bright and breezy, perfect for morning walks and afternoon painting sessions on the fire escape. I'd developed a routine that prioritized my well-being without feeling selfish. Morning coffee and meditation, walk to the park and back, grocery shopping for foods I enjoyed instead of budget-stretching basics, afternoon art time, evening reading or phone calls with friends, simple pleasures that had been impossible during the years of crisis management, when every day brought new emergencies and every moment of peace was interrupted by Danny's needs. My bank account was growing instead of shrinking. Not dramatically, I was still living on Social Security and a modest pension, but consistently. Money that used to disappear into the black hole of his addiction was accumulating into a small emergency fund that existed for my emergencies instead of his artificial ones. I opened a separate savings account and started automatically transferring $50 each month. The fund was designated for travel. The first time in 20 years I'd planned something for my own enjoyment instead of someone else's crisis. Where did I want to go? The question felt foreign and thrilling. During the years of enabling, travel had been impossible because Danny's emergencies were unpredictable, and my money wasn't really mine. But now I could imagine possibilities. Visiting Margaret in Phoenix, taking a cruise, exploring New England during fall foliage season. The freedom to plan beyond the next crisis was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. I'd spent so long living in reactive mode that proactive thinking felt like learning a new language. Danny called again in July, 3 months into his residential treatment program. His voice was stronger now, more present, like he was actually inhabiting his body instead of just borrowing it temporarily. "I want to tell you something," he said without preamble. "I stole from you, not just the fake rent money. I took cash from your purse when I visited. I used your credit card numbers to make online purchases. I sold things from your apartment when you were at work." The confession hit like cold water. I'd suspected some of this, but had never wanted to investigate thoroughly. Facing the full extent of his manipulation and theft would have required acknowledging how completely I'd been victimized by someone I loved. "How much?" I asked quietly. "I don't know exactly. Thousands. Maybe 10,000 over the years. $10,000, a vacation around the world, a new car, a significant addition to retirement savings, gone into veins and smoke and the temporary relief of chemical oblivion. I want to pay you back," he continued. "It's going to take years, maybe decades, but I want to make this right. I don't want your money, Danny. I need to pay you back. For me, not for you. I need to take responsibility for the harm I caused." This was new. Previous apologies had focused on my feelings, on making me feel better so I'd resume enabling his addiction. This apology acknowledged concrete harm and proposed concrete amends, regardless of how it affected our relationship. "We can discuss that when you're out of treatment. Right now, focus on getting well." I am getting well. For the first time in my adult life, I'm clean and I want to stay clean. Not because someone's making me, but because using drugs is destroying everything I care about. Including me, I thought, but didn't say. Using drugs had nearly destroyed me too, though his treatment program probably focused on the harm to him rather than the collateral damage to everyone around him. I'm proud of you for doing the work. It's the hardest thing I've ever done. Harder than getting clean, harder than staying clean. Looking at what I've done to the people I love. Accepting responsibility without making excuses. I understand why you cut me off. I understand why you couldn't save me from myself. Understanding. The gift I'd been trying to give him for years finally arrived at through his own experience instead of my explanations. After the call, I sat on my fire escape watching the neighborhood come alive with evening activities. Families heading to dinner, couples walking hand in hand, teenagers gathering on stoops with the casual confidence of people who believed the world belonged to them. For the first time in years, I felt like I belonged to that world too. Not as someone managing a crisis or enabling someone else's self-destruction, but as an individual with value independent of my usefulness to others. The realization was profound and simple. I mattered. Not because of what I could provide, not because of my willingness to sacrifice everything for someone else's needs, but because I was a human being deserving of respect and care. I'd spent so long defining myself through Danny's problems that I'd forgotten I existed separately from his addiction. Linda, the mother, had consumed Linda, the individual, leaving no space for dreams or desires that weren't connected to fixing someone else. But Linda, the individual, was still here. Older, wiser, scarred, but not broken, ready to reclaim the life I'd put on hold while trying to save someone who could only be saved by himself. That weekend, I did something unprecedented. I booked a vacation. 3 days in Cape Cod, staying at a bed and breakfast within walking distance of the ocean. The cost seemed enormous until I calculated how much money I'd saved by not sending Danny $800 each month for the past 6 months. $4,800. Enough for dozens of vacations, hundreds of small luxuries, thousands of moments of joy I'd denied myself in service of his addiction. The trip was scheduled for September, my first solo vacation since before Danny was born. The anticipation felt foreign and wonderful, like being a teenager again and counting days until summer break. I bought a new suitcase, modest but mine. I researched restaurants and art galleries and walking trails. I imagined myself painting watercolors of lighthouses and seascapes, creating art inspired by beauty instead of therapy. The night before I left for Cape Cod, Danny called from treatment. He was scheduled to be discharged the following week and wanted to discuss his plans. "I'm going to stay in Boston for a while," he said. "There's a sober house that has space, and I found a job at a restaurant. Nothing fancy, but it's honest work, and it pays enough to cover my expenses." Honest work. The phrase suggested he'd developed awareness of what dishonest work looked like, how he'd been living off others instead of supporting himself. That sounds like a good plan. "I want to see you when you're ready, but I understand if you need more time. I understand if you never want to see me again. I want to see you, Danny, but I want to see you sober, self-supporting, and taking responsibility for your choices. I want that too. I want to be someone you can be proud of instead of someone you have to rescue." The conversation was brief but substantial. No manipulation, no requests for money, no attempts to make me responsible for his success or failure. Just information shared between two adults who cared about each other but respected each other's autonomy. Cape Cod was everything I'd hoped for and more. The bed and breakfast was run by a couple in their 70s who treated solo travelers like treasured guests rather than lonely outcasts. My room overlooked the harbor, with windows that opened to let in salt air and the sound of waves. I painted each morning on the small deck outside my room, capturing the changing light on water and the weathered beauty of fishing boats. The watercolors were loose, impressionistic, joyful in ways my earlier work had never been. Afternoons I spent walking the shoreline, collecting shells and sea glass, feeling sand between my toes and sun on my face. Simple pleasures that had seemed impossible during the years of crisis management, when every moment of peace was shadowed by worry about Danny's next emergency. Evenings I ate dinner alone at small restaurants, reading novels and people watching without apologizing for my solitude. Solo dining had once seemed pathetic, evidence of social failure. Now it felt like luxury. The freedom to eat what I wanted when I wanted without negotiating anyone else's needs or problems. The other guests at the bed and breakfast were mostly couples celebrating anniversaries or empty nesters exploring retirement possibilities. They included me in conversations without pity, treating my solo status as a choice rather than a misfortune. "Are you an artist?" asked Helen, a retired librarian from Vermont who'd admired my morning painting sessions. "I'm learning to be," I said, surprised by my own honesty. For years, I'd downplayed any talents or interests that weren't related to fixing Danny. But this felt safe, removed from the chaos of my regular life. "It's never too late to become who you were meant to be," she said, and something in her tone suggested she was speaking from experience. On my last day, I hiked to a lighthouse overlooking the Atlantic, carrying my painting supplies and a simple lunch. The view was spectacular. Endless ocean stretching to the horizon, waves breaking against rocky shores, seabirds riding air currents with effortless grace. I painted for hours, losing myself in the meditation of brush on paper, color flowing into form. The painting that emerged was different from anything I'd done before. Confident, alive, unafraid of bold colors or strong contrasts. Looking at it, I barely recognized the artist who'd created it. This wasn't the work of someone broken by enabling and manipulation. This was the work of someone who'd reclaimed her power and was learning to use it for joy instead of survival. The drive home from Cape Cod took me through small New England towns that looked like postcards. White churches, town squares, houses with wraparound porches and flower gardens. I stopped frequently, not because I was tired, but because I wanted to savor the journey instead of rushing toward the destination. This was freedom. Not just freedom from Danny's crises, but freedom to move through the world at my own pace, making choices based on my desires instead of someone else's emergencies. Back in Queens, my apartment felt different. Smaller, but more mine. The paintings I'd done in Cape Cod joined the growing collection on my walls, evidence of reclaimed creativity and joy. Margaret called that evening to hear about the trip. "You sound different," she said. "Lighter, more like yourself." "I feel like myself. For the first time in years, I feel like Linda instead of Danny's mother." "How are you handling his calls?" "They're different now. Real recovery looks different from manipulation disguised as recovery." We talked for an hour about art and travel and books, subjects that had nothing to do with addiction or enabling or crisis management. Normal conversation between sisters who cared about each other's well-being and happiness. Danny was discharged from treatment the following week. He called to share his new address and phone number, but didn't ask for money or support or visits. Just information shared between adults who were learning to have a healthy relationship. "I start work tomorrow," he said. "Kitchen prep at a seafood restaurant. It's not glamorous, but it's a start. I'm proud of you for building a life you can sustain. I'm proud of you for refusing to enable my addiction. It took courage to let me hit bottom, and I know it wasn't easy." The acknowledgement meant more than any apology. Recognition that my boundaries had been loving instead of cruel, necessary instead of optional, healing instead of harmful. We agreed to meet for lunch the following month if his recovery continued progressing. Not a reunion dinner at my apartment where I'd cook his favorite foods and fall back into caretaking patterns, but a neutral meeting in a public space where we could interact as adults. The anticipation was different from anything I'd felt regarding Danny in years. Not the anxiety of wondering what crisis he'd bring or how much money he'd need, but genuine curiosity about who he was becoming in recovery. That October afternoon when we met for lunch was crisp and bright, the kind of New York day that reminds you why people fall in love with the city despite its challenges. I arrived at the restaurant early, nervous but excited, wearing the red sweater Margaret had bought me months earlier. Danny was already there, sitting at a corner table, looking healthier than I'd seen him in years. His face had filled out, his eyes were clear, his clothes were clean and well-fitted. He looked like someone who was taking care of himself instead of someone barely surviving day to day. "Hi, Mom." "Hi, Danny." We hugged, and it felt different from the desperate, guilt-laden embraces of the past. This felt like two people who cared about each other but weren't trying to fix or save or manipulate each other. Lunch lasted 3 hours. We talked about his job, his sober house, his plans for completing his GED, and maybe taking community college classes. We talked about my art, my Al-Anon meetings, my trip to Cape Cod. Most remarkably, we talked about the past without blame or defensiveness. He took responsibility for his choices and their consequences. I took responsibility for my enabling behaviors and the changes I'd made. "I used to think you were supposed to love me no matter what I did," he said over coffee. "I thought unconditional love meant you'd always rescue me from my mistakes." I thought that too. I thought good mothers never said no to their children's needs. But my needs weren't real needs. They were manufactured crises designed to keep the money coming. The honesty was painful and liberating. For the first time, we were discussing our relationship without lies or manipulation or emotional blackmail. "I want to pay you back," he said again. "Not just the money I stole, but the emotional damage I caused. I know that's going to take time and consistent behavior, not just words. I want us to build a relationship based on mutual respect and healthy boundaries. Money is less important than trust." As we said goodbye in front of the restaurant, I felt something I hadn't expected. Hope. Not the desperate, irrational hope I'd clung to during his addiction, but realistic hope based on observable changes in his behavior and attitude. He might relapse. Recovery was rarely linear, and addiction was a chronic illness that required lifelong management. But whether he stayed sober or not, I had changed. I had learned to separate love from enabling, support from rescue, hope from denial. I would never again sacrifice my well-being for someone else's addiction. I would never again confuse financial support with emotional love. I would never again allow guilt and fear to override my instincts about what was healthy and sustainable. The walk home took me through neighborhoods I'd driven through thousands of times without really seeing. Food trucks serving cuisine from around the world. Community gardens where residents grew vegetables and flowers. Parks where children played while grandparents watched from benches. This was my city, the place I'd lived for decades while focused entirely on crisis management. Now I was seeing it with fresh eyes, appreciating its diversity and energy, and the possibility for connection with people who wanted nothing from me except friendship. That evening, I painted the view from the restaurant where Danny and I had lunch. Not a photographic representation, but an emotional response to the experience. Warm colors suggesting hope, strong lines indicating new boundaries, light that seemed to come from within rather than external sources. The painting joined the growing collection on my walls, evidence of a life reclaimed and rebuilt. Each piece told part of my story. The dark paintings from the worst period of enabling, the tentative works from early recovery, the bold pieces from Cape Cod and beyond. An artist friend from my watercolor class visited the following week and was amazed by the progression visible in the paintings. "You can see your healing in the brushstrokes," she said. "The early work is so constrained, so careful. The recent pieces are fearless. Fearless." I like that description. Not because I'd stopped feeling fear, but because I'd stopped letting fear make my decisions for me. Danny and I met monthly for lunch throughout the fall and winter. Each visit confirmed his commitment to recovery and my commitment to healthy boundaries. He was building a life that didn't require rescue, and I was building a life that wasn't defined by someone else's crises. He started sending small payments toward paying back the money he'd stolen, $25 a month, all he could afford on his restaurant salary while paying for housing, food, and other necessities. The amount was tiny compared to the total debt, but the consistency mattered more than the quantity. "I know it's going to take years," he said, handing me a check during one of our lunches. "But I want you to know that I remember what I took, and I intend to make it right." The checks were proof of his changed priorities. During his addiction, $25 would have been spent on drugs within hours of earning it. Now he was sacrificing immediate gratification for long-term responsibility. Spring arrived early that year, with daffodils blooming in March and trees budding weeks ahead of schedule. I celebrated my 68th birthday alone, by choice, with a long walk through Central Park and a solo dinner at a restaurant I'd always wanted to try. The solitude felt luxurious rather than lonely. I could eat slowly, savor each bite, people watch without feeling obligated to include anyone else in my observations or experiences. My phone rang during dessert. Danny, calling to wish me happy birthday and share news. He'd been promoted to line cook and was planning to enroll in community college classes in the fall. "I want to study business," he said. "Maybe open a restaurant someday. A legitimate business that helps people instead of hurting them. Dreams." He was allowing himself to have dreams again, something that had been impossible during active addiction when every thought was focused on the next high. I think that sounds wonderful. I couldn't have imagined this a year ago. Being sober, having goals, making plans that extend beyond the next 24 hours. What changed? You stopped making it easy for me to fail. When using became genuinely difficult instead of artificially comfortable, recovery started looking like the better option. The gratitude in his voice was real, not manufactured to manipulate me into resuming old patterns. He understood that my boundaries had been gifts disguised as cruelty, love expressed through refusal to participate in his self-destruction. That summer, I took another vacation, this time with Margaret to visit our childhood home in upstate New York. The town had changed dramatically since we'd left 40 years earlier, but the house where we'd grown up was still standing, now painted blue instead of white, but recognizably the same. We knocked on the door and asked the current owners if we could see the backyard where our father had taught us to garden. They were gracious, inviting us for coffee and sharing stories about the house's quirks and charms. Standing in that backyard, I remembered who I'd been before Danny's addiction had consumed my identity. A girl who loved art and books and growing tomatoes. A young woman with dreams that extended beyond fixing other people's problems. Those parts of me hadn't died during the years of enabling. They'd simply gone dormant, waiting for permission to emerge again. "Do you ever regret not having children?" I asked Margaret as we drove home. No. Do you ever regret having them? The question would have horrified me a year earlier. Good mothers weren't supposed to experience regret about their children, even children whose addictions had nearly destroyed them. I regret some of the choices I made as a mother. I regret enabling instead of helping, but I don't regret loving Danny, even when that love was imperfect. Love is always imperfect. The goal isn't perfect love. It's sustainable love that doesn't destroy the lover. Sustainable love. The phrase captured everything I'd learned about healthy relationships, addiction, and recovery. Love that could last because it didn't require self-sacrifice to the point of self-destruction. Fall brought news that Danny had been accepted into community college and was planning to study business management while continuing to work at the restaurant. His loan application had been approved, meaning he could afford tuition without asking me for financial help. "I want you to be proud of me," he said during one of our lunch meetings. "Not proud of who I might become, but proud of who I'm becoming right now." I was proud. Not because he was sober. Sobriety was something he was doing for himself, not for me, but because he was building a life based on responsibility and integrity instead of manipulation and dependence. The transformation was visible in small details. The way he paid for his own meals instead of assuming I'd cover the check. The way he asked about my life instead of focusing entirely on his own situation. The way he showed up on time, sober and present instead of desperate and distracted. "I'm proud of both of us," I said. "You for doing the work of recovery, and me for learning the difference between helping and enabling." Christmas that year was different from any we'd shared in decades. Instead of the tense gift exchanges and artificial cheer that had characterized previous holidays, we had a simple, honest celebration. Danny came to my apartment bearing a gift he'd made himself. A wooden box he'd crafted in a woodworking class. The craftsmanship was amateur, but the effort was genuine, evidence of his willingness to invest time and creativity instead of money he didn't have. Inside the box was a letter, handwritten on simple notebook paper. "Mom, I can't give you back the years I stole with my addiction. I can't undo the financial damage or the emotional pain I caused. But I can promise you that the person I'm becoming is someone worthy of your love and sacrifice. Thank you for refusing to enable my sickness. Thank you for loving me enough to let me fail. Thank you for showing me that recovery is possible, even when it seems impossible. Love, Danny." Reading the letter, I cried for the first time in months. Not the desperate, helpless tears of crisis management, but the cleansing tears of grief transformed into gratitude. We'd both survived his addiction and my enabling. We'd both learned difficult lessons about love, boundaries, and personal responsibility. We'd both discovered that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to participate in someone else's self-destruction. The wooden box sits on my kitchen table now, holding the small payments Danny continues to send each month toward his debt. The amount has increased as his income has grown, but the consistency has remained constant for over a year. More importantly, it holds evidence of our transformed relationship. Concert tickets from shows we've attended together. Danny treating me with money he earned honestly. Photos from his college graduation ceremony, where he received his associate's degree in business management. The business plan for the restaurant he hopes to open someday, written in his own hand with calculations that don't involve asking me for startup capital. He's 28 now, 5 years older than when this story began. I'm 71, older and wiser and infinitely more peaceful than I was during the years of crisis management. We see each other regularly, but not constantly. We talk on the phone weekly, but not daily. We love each other deeply, but not destructively. The boundaries I thought would destroy our relationship have actually saved it. By refusing to enable his addiction, I created space for genuine recovery. By refusing to sacrifice myself for his problems, I preserved something worth loving. My art has continued evolving, growing bolder and more expressive with each passing year. The community center has started displaying my paintings in their lobby, and several pieces have sold to other students and friends. I'm no longer embarrassed to call myself an artist. Creating beauty and meaning through color and brushstrokes feels as legitimate as any other work I've done, more fulfilling than most. The Al-Anon meetings continue to be a source of strength and wisdom. I've become something of a mentor to newer members who are struggling with the early stages of learning to set boundaries with addicted family members. "How do you know when it's time to stop helping?" they ask, and I share my story of fake addresses and stolen money and love that had become indistinguishable from suicide. When helping makes the situation worse instead of better, I tell them. When your love becomes the obstacle to their recovery instead of the motivation for it. Some of them aren't ready to hear this message. They're still convinced that the right combination of love, money, and sacrifice will cure their family member's addiction. I was there once too, so I don't judge their denial. But others are ready to consider that their helping might be hurting, that their love might be enabling, that sometimes the most mother thing you can do is refuse to be a mother in the traditional sense. They keep my phone number and call during moments of crisis when the temptation to send money or provide rescue feels overwhelming. I remind them that addiction is a disease that requires professional treatment, not amateur intervention, that you can't save someone from drowning if you don't know how to swim yourself. The holidays have become celebrations again instead of endurance tests. Danny contributes to family gatherings with food he's prepared himself, stories from work and school, plans for the future that don't require financial support from me. He's been sober for over 3 years now. The changes in him are more than just absence of drugs and alcohol. He's become someone I genuinely enjoy spending time with. Intelligent, funny, responsible, caring. The person he might have become if addiction hadn't interrupted his development for so many years. But I've learned to separate his recovery from my well-being. Whether he stays sober or relapses, I will maintain the boundaries that saved both our lives. Whether he succeeds in his goals or struggles with setbacks, I will love him without enabling him. This is what sustainable love looks like. Care without control, support without rescue, hope without denial. Last month, Danny paid off the last of the money he'd stolen from me over the years. The final check was for $37, bringing the total repayment to exactly $10,412 spread across 4 years of consistent monthly payments. The money itself mattered less than what it represented. His commitment to making amends, taking responsibility, and rebuilding trust through actions instead of words. "This doesn't make us even," he said when he handed me the final check. "You can't put a price on what you sacrificed during my addiction, but it feels important to finish what I started." I deposited the check and used the money to book another vacation, this time to Ireland, a dream trip I'd postponed for decades while managing other people's crises. The irony wasn't lost on me. Money stolen to feed his addiction was being transformed into experiences that fed my soul. Dublin and the Irish countryside were everything I'd imagined, and more. Ancient castles, green hills that seemed to glow from within, pubs where strangers became friends over pints of Guinness and shared stories. I painted every day, capturing landscapes that seemed mythical in their beauty. The light in Ireland was unlike anything I'd ever seen, soft and golden and constantly changing as clouds moved across enormous skies. The trip was my first time traveling internationally, something that would have been impossible during the years of crisis management, when I never knew when Danny's next emergency might require my immediate return home. Now I could travel without guilt or anxiety, secure in the knowledge that he was building a life that didn't require constant intervention from me. The paintings I brought back from Ireland are some of my favorites. Bold, confident works that capture not just the landscapes, but my emotional response to finally living for myself instead of someone else's problems. They hang in my apartment now alongside the Cape Cod pieces and the New York cityscapes, creating a visual journal of my recovery from enabling and codependence. Friends who visit are amazed by the transformation in both my living space and my demeanor. The stressed, exhausted woman who used to jump every time the phone rang has been replaced by someone calmer, more centered, genuinely happy instead of just surviving. "You look 10 years younger," said Eleanor from my book club, studying the Ireland paintings. "Recovery suits you." Recovery. She was right to call it that. I'd been as sick as Danny during his addiction, just in different ways. He'd been poisoning himself with chemicals while I'd been poisoning myself with enabling behaviors and martyr complexes. We'd both needed treatment, though mine had come through Al-Anon meetings and therapy instead of residential programs. We'd both needed to learn new ways of thinking and behaving that prioritized health over familiar patterns of destruction. The difference was that I'd recovered from codependence and enabling while he'd recovered from addiction. 2 different diseases, but both requiring rigorous honesty, willingness to change, and support from people who understood the specific challenges involved. Danny is 30 now, married to a woman he met in recovery, who understands the importance of supporting sobriety without enabling addiction. They have a small apartment in Boston, jobs they enjoy, and plans that extend months and years into the future, instead of just days. I attend their Recaviversary celebrations each year, gatherings where people mark clean time the same way others celebrate birthdays or anniversaries. The community they've built around recovery is strong and supportive, focused on personal growth and healthy relationships instead of crisis management. Watching Danny interact with his recovery friends, I see glimpses of the person he might have become if addiction hadn't interrupted his development. But I also see someone who's been tempered by experience, who understands the fragility of sobriety and the importance of daily vigilance. He sponsors other people in early recovery now, guiding them through the same steps that helped him build a life worth living. Part of his message to them is about the importance of family boundaries, how enabling disguised as love can actually prevent recovery from happening. My mother saved my life by refusing to enable my addiction, he tells them. The hardest thing a parent can do is watch their child struggle without jumping in to fix everything. But sometimes that struggle is exactly what's needed for real change to happen. I'm 73 now, old enough to qualify for senior discounts and Medicare supplements, but still young enough to travel, create art, and build new friendships. The last few years have taught me that life doesn't end when your children leave home or when you stop being needed as a rescuer. If anything, life becomes richer when you reclaim the energy and resources that were being drained by other people's crises. Time that was spent worrying can be redirected toward activities that bring joy. Money that was disappearing into someone else's addiction can be invested in experiences that create lasting memories. The apartment that once felt cramped with worry and crisis now feels spacious and peaceful. I've redecorated slowly, replacing furniture that held difficult memories with pieces chosen for comfort and beauty. The corner that used to be Danny's shrine is now my art studio, filled with supplies and finished works that represent my authentic interests instead of my compulsive caregiving. My bedroom no longer has a phone beside the bed because I no longer wait for crisis calls that might require immediate response. I sleep through the night now, deeply and peacefully, without the hypervigilance that characterized the years of crisis management. The changes seem small, but their cumulative effect has been transformative. I wake up each morning curious about what the day might bring instead of bracing for whatever emergency might interrupt my plans. This is what recovery looks like for someone who's been addicted to enabling. Days that belong to you instead of someone else's problems. Thoughts that aren't dominated by worry about things you can't control. Energy available for creativity and connection and simple pleasures. Last week, Danny called with news. He and his wife are expecting their first child. My first grandchild, due in the spring. I want you to be involved, he said. But I also want you to know that we're prepared to raise this child without financial help from family. We want to model independence and responsibility. The statement would have hurt my feelings during the years when I equated love with financial support. Now it sounds like wisdom. Evidence that he's learned to separate care from cash, to value relationships over transactions. I'd love to be involved, and I respect your commitment to financial independence. We talked about nursery colors and baby furniture, sleep schedules and childcare options, all the ordinary concerns of expectant parents building a life together. The conversation was normal in ways our discussions never used to be, free from hidden agendas and unspoken expectations. I'm excited about becoming a grandmother, but not in the desperate way I used to be excited about Danny's promises and fresh starts. This is calm excitement, based on realistic expectations and healthy boundaries. I'll love this grandchild deeply, but not destructively. I'll offer support that strengthens, rather than enabling that weakens. I'll be present without being intrusive, helpful without being controlling. The lessons learned through Danny's addiction and my recovery from enabling will protect this new relationship from the patterns that nearly destroyed us. Love without boundaries isn't really love at all. It's need disguised as care, fear disguised as devotion. Real love requires the courage to say no when yes would be harmful, to allow struggle when rescue would prevent growth, to prioritize long-term well-being over short-term comfort. As I prepare for grandmotherhood, I'm also preparing for the next chapter of my own life. I've enrolled in advanced painting classes and am considering pursuing a bachelor's degree in art, something I never finished because Danny's needs always took precedence. At 73, returning to school feels both terrifying and exhilarating. But age is just a number, and it's never too late to become who you were meant to be before someone else's crisis interrupted your development. The community college near my apartment offers classes specifically for seniors returning to education. The other students are inspiring, people who've survived divorces, deaths, financial catastrophes, health crises, and other life events that temporarily derailed their dreams. We share stories during break time, creating connections based on resilience and determination rather than shared problems or complaints. This is what healthy community looks like. People supporting each other's growth instead of enabling each other's dysfunction. My bank account continues to grow slowly but steadily, money accumulating for future dreams instead of disappearing into current crises. I'm planning another international trip for next year, possibly to Italy to study Renaissance art in person. The freedom to plan more than a few weeks ahead still feels miraculous. During the years of crisis management, long-term planning was impossible because Danny's emergencies could disrupt any agenda at any moment. Now I can book non-refundable tickets, make reservations, commit to classes and activities without wondering if I'll need to cancel everything to manage someone else's latest disaster. This is what peace looks like. The ability to inhabit your own life instead of just managing other people's crises. Margaret visits twice a year now, staying long enough to see my latest paintings and hear updates about Danny's continued recovery. She's proud of both of us for doing the hard work of changing patterns that could have destroyed our entire family. I was worried I'd lose both of you, she admits during her last visit. You to codependence and him to addiction. But look at you now. Both healthy, both growing, both building lives worth living. The observation strikes me as profound. We hadn't just avoided tragedy. We'd created something positive from the ruins of dysfunction. Recovery isn't just about stopping harmful behaviors. It's about replacing them with life-affirming alternatives. Danny's recovery looks like steady employment, healthy relationships, financial responsibility, and service to others struggling with similar challenges. My recovery looks like creativity, independence, healthy boundaries, and the reclamation of dreams that had been deferred for decades. Both of our recoveries look like lives that contribute to the world instead of just consuming resources, relationships that add value instead of creating drama, days that end with satisfaction instead of exhaustion. The phone rings now with invitations instead of emergencies, friends calling to share good news instead of relatives demanding immediate intervention in the latest crisis. This is what normal feels like after years of chaos. Boring in the best possible way. Danny's baby is due in 3 weeks. He's taken parenting classes, prepared a nursery, read books about child development and attachment theory. He's approaching fatherhood with the same seriousness he brought to recovery. Thorough preparation combined with humility about how much he still has to learn. I want to break the cycle, he told me during our last lunch together. I want this child to grow up with a father who's present instead of absent, reliable instead of chaotic. The cycle. He understands that addiction and enabling often pass from generation to generation unless someone makes a conscious decision to change the pattern. His sobriety isn't just about his own well-being. It's about protecting his child from inheriting the family disease. I understand something similar about my recovery from enabling. By learning to set healthy boundaries, I'm modeling self-respect and personal responsibility instead of martyrdom and codependence. This grandchild will grow up seeing adults who take care of themselves instead of sacrificing everything for other people's problems. The legacy we're creating is one of recovery, resilience, and respect for personal boundaries. Not perfect people leading perfect lives, but people who've learned from their mistakes and are committed to doing better. Last night, I painted a portrait of Danny holding his newborn daughter, a piece created entirely from imagination since she hasn't been born yet. But I can see them together in my mind. Sober father meeting healthy daughter, both of them surrounded by love that enhances instead of enabling, supports instead of rescues. The painting shows him looking directly at her, present and unimpaired, capable of genuine connection instead of the desperate neediness that characterized his addiction. She looks back with the clear eyes of someone who will grow up feeling truly seen and valued. This is my gift to both of them. The vision of a relationship built on authentic love instead of manipulation or guilt. Evidence that recovery makes real intimacy possible, that healing creates space for genuine human connection. The painting will hang in my living room until Danny is ready to take it home, but it belongs to all three of us. Grandfather, father, and daughter. 3 generations connected by love that has been tested by fire and emerged stronger. Tomorrow, Danny's wife goes in for her final prenatal appointment. Next week, I become a grandmother for the first time. Next month, I start my advanced painting classes. Next season, I travel to Italy to study art in museums I've only seen in books. Each milestone represents the continuation of a life reclaimed from crisis management and redirection toward joy, growth, and authentic self-expression. This is what the other side of enabling looks like. Not just survival, but thriving. Not just boundaries, but freedom. Not just recovery, but rebirth into someone you were always meant to be. If you're listening to this story and recognizing yourself in the patterns of enabling, manipulation, or codependence, please know that change is possible at any age. It's never too late to reclaim your life from someone else's crisis. Recovery from enabling requires the same courage that recovery from addiction demands. The willingness to face uncomfortable truths, make difficult changes, and persist even when the people you love are angry about your new boundaries. But the rewards are immeasurable. Peace instead of chaos, growth instead of stagnation, genuine love instead of desperate need disguised as care. You deserve to live your own life instead of just managing other people's problems. You deserve relationships based on mutual respect instead of one-sided sacrifice. You deserve to discover who you are when you're not defined by someone else's crisis. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where love became enabling? Where helping someone actually made their problems worse instead of better? Have you ever had to choose between someone else's comfort and your own well-being? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear. to start their own journey toward healthy boundaries and authentic love. If this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. Your support helps me continue sharing these difficult but necessary conversations about love, family, and the courage required to save yourself before you can truly help anyone else. Thank you for listening to my heart. Thank you for being part of this community of people who understand that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to participate in someone else's destruction. Recovery is possible. Boundaries work. Love without enabling is not only possible, but necessary for everyone's well-being. You are worth saving. Your dreams matter. Your life belongs to you. Remember that, especially during the moments when guilt and fear try to convince you otherwise. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring. Thank you for being brave enough to consider that there might be another way to love.